All right, and joining us to talk a little bit more about the G20 Summit is Harsh Pant, Distinguished Fellow at the ORF. Harsh, thanks very much for talking to us this evening. Now, a lot of the emphasis from the American side, at least in the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump, was on trade, while the Indian side, of course, tried to highlight other issues that need the focus of the two countries as well. It seemed that Donald Trump was emphasizing trade again and again.
Well, clearly, I think trade is very important for Mr. Trump. Trade is very important for his domestic constituencies as he goes into the election mode. Trade is a defining feature, has been a defining feature of his electoral campaign in the past, and continues to be a matter of concern for his constituency as he goes into his re-election campaign. So clearly, for him, trade is very important. Trade is the primary driver of his foreign policy agenda, and trade is something on which he has been talking to, not simply to India, but even to countries like China, who are seen as more adversarial, but also to the allies of America. I mean, his comments on Japan and Germany were quite revealing, where he said that Japan would continue to watch, if America is attacked, what would Japan do? And Japan would continue to watch television, Sony television. And I think there is a sense in which his assessment is that America has been treated unfairly, and therefore trade needs to be at the front and center of his engagement.
Right.
The problem with that argument from India's side is that it makes something which is an irritant to be the central narrative of the relationship, and which is something that India has tried to rectify in at least this week. What we have seen from both Mr. Pompeo's visit as well as the bilateral engagement between Modi and Trump.
Right, but Harsh, even having said that, there have been very little concessions nonetheless from the American side. We know that when Mike Pompeo was here, Iran issue was raised, the fact that we need affordable pricing on crude oil. Other issues were also, talked about, particularly with Donald Trump today. The 5G network issue was also brought to his attention. So clearly, this relationship is both transactional at one level, but also seems to be very unilateral on the other.
Yes, I think, Mr. Trump's worldview does not allow for a great degree of maneuverability. But I think India seems to have done relatively well in terms of, how it has created a space for its own interests. And that is what you saw, for example, the fact that India continues to have these trilaterals with Russia and China and on the one hand, and with Japan and America on the other, talking about having two very different set of conversations with these two different groups of countries. And there perhaps India is signaling to Americans that, look, India is in a position where it can afford to choose. India is in a position where it can afford to have partners like China and Russia. And therefore, India should not be taken as lightly as perhaps he seems to take his other allies, because India does not really depend on America fundamentally for its security, like Japan does, for example, or even Australia and Europe does. So there's clearly a lag in terms of his understanding, of Trump's understanding of where India is coming from. But my sense is that what Mr. Pompeo tried to do in India was also focus on the big picture. So therefore, there was a lot of talk, and even Mr. Trump has talked about, for example, on Iran. He said, well, there is a lot that there's a lot of time available for India to think about it. So clearly, I think both sides are trying to see how the irritants from trade can be normalized, and this relationship can again attain a positive trajectory, which it seems to have come away from in the recent days.
Right, but also, of course, as you mentioned, there were other trilaterals, one important one being with Russia and China, where all three nations, we believe, highlighted the need for, a liberalized global economy, that it should not be dictated by protectionism or unilateral action by certain countries. Clearly, all three hinting there at America.
Absolutely, and I think that's where India is, positioning itself in a camp, if you will, with the Russians and the Chinese, where the discussion is about the emerging global economic order, which Trump administration has very unilaterally tried to reframe around protectionism. And that's a challenge, I think, for not simply for India, for China and for Russia, but for all the emerging economies. And if you look at the discourse on protectionism and the growing economic inequities in the system, that's a discussion where America finds itself largely isolated. So clearly there are limits to what America can perhaps do, even on trade, at a time when America is, not simply looking at having these bilateral engagements with countries across the world, but also trying to position itself as a country that is not on a downward trajectory. And I think India's positioning with China and Russia gives it that kind of leverage vis-a-vis America that perhaps it wants at this stage, where America, as you were mentioning in your last question, is trying to dictate the agenda for India. And I think having these kind of trilaterals allows India that space, and I think that's what India has been trying to do since last G20, where I think this framing became apparent, and this has continued even in this G20.
Right. Harsh, thanks very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts on how the G20 panned out for India and the rest of the country.